preaching biblical Christianity to third world nations.
God spoke to the void, and the universe showed up. Our universe contains about 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. There are over 100 parameters that had to be precisely, exactly so, for life to exist on our planet. But of course, life does exist, created and sustained by God. Today, there are almost 6.5 billion people in our world. Our cultures vary, yet we share the same miracle, life. The human body is the pinnacle of God's creative genius. Today, science strives to learn more about our past in order to create a better future. Yet as scientists discover what God already knows, the details of a grand design begin to emerge. We should not fear science. God invented science. A clear understanding of what He has done only enhances our view of Him. God's power is undeniable. His precision is impressive. His sovereignty is on display. How can such power fail to dominate our every thought and action, to rescue us from our everyday insecurities? It is not that God has failed to demonstrate His nature. It is just that we are slow to understand. What we need is a new vision of God, the real God. More Than Meets the Eye is a 4-part video series demonstrating a God who is brilliant and wise, powerful and precise, intimate and personal. The more we understand about God's power, the less we worry about our weakness. Richard Swenson, MD, is a physician, futurist, best-selling author, and award-winning educator. He has researched the material you are about to see, and his insight has become his passion. In 2003, the Christian Medical and Dental Associations honored Dr. Swenson with the Educator of the Year award. Dr. Swenson has traveled to over 50 countries for purposes of speaking, practice, or study. He has presented to a wide variety of career, professional, educational, medical, governmental, and management groups, including the Mayo Clinic, the Pentagon, members of the United Nations, and members of Congress. Dr. Swenson is author of 6 books, including More Than Meets the Eye.
Did you know that every second, at least 5 million neutrinos pass through your thumbnail? Maybe as many as 5 billion neutrinos. Now, neutrinos are made in the furnace of the sun. The sun is a non-stop thermonuclear bomb. Every second, about 4 million tons of the surface of the sun is converted into energy, and that goes into photons, but also neutrinos, and they scream across the solar system and out into outer space, and they're doing it all the time. And neutrinos weigh almost nothing. They weigh 500,000 times less than an electron. An electron weighs almost nothing. Neutrinos move at about the speed of light. They can go through 1 trillion miles of lead and not slow down. Every single second, like 5 million to 5 billion of those pass through your thumbnail. You can hide in your bathtub, you can go on the 3rd floor, you can go in your closet, lie under your bed, go in a bank vault, doesn't make any difference. These neutrinos will find you. Now, you can have a very successful and happy life, you can have a happy family, you can have wonderful faith, and not know this about neutrinos, but you see, it's true whether we're aware of it or whether we're not aware of it. Now, look again at your thumbnail. You know your thumbnail grows. Every once in a while, you have to cut your thumbnail. The growth rate of your thumbnail is the same rate that Mount Everest is migrating toward China. Mount Everest is on the move, it's moving toward China, and the speed with which it's moving is the same speed that your thumbnail is growing. Again, you can have a very happy and successful life without realizing this, but there are a lot of things that are true even though we don't realize them. If you look in the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, and I don't know how this verse got in the love chapter, but it says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I also am known. I don't know about you, but I'm frustrated with the glass darkly. I'm frustrated with the dimness of our sight and our understanding. I want to see face to face. I want to see more clearly. I want to know even as I also am known. Someday God's going to get up from the sitting room of heaven. He's going to walk across the room and he's going to turn off the television set. And when he does that, the reality that we know here, which is true, we're not an illusion, this is true, this is real, but it's a sub-reality. The dominant reality that is where God is now will take over. He will introduce himself to us and we will see him face to face. And I have a feeling that once we know, even as we also are known, once we see God face to face, it'll take care of a lot of our perspective problems. Let's take a look at ways through science that we can see God more clearly. I'm not saying that science is a source of revelation like the Scriptures or like the Holy Spirit, but increasingly, science is not an enemy of faith, but an ally of faith. It introduces us to some of the genius of God, some of the brilliance of God. It is, as a matter of fact, unfathomable what God has done. Let's look at the human body. The human body is the pinnacle of God's creative genius. Scriptures say in Genesis 1, also Genesis 5, that we're made in his image. What does that mean to be made in the image of God? We read in Psalm 8 and repeated in Hebrews 2 that we are created a little lower than the angels and we are crowned with glory and honor. Psalm 139, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. You see, the words of Scripture suggest to us that if you want to see God's majesty on display, you don't have to look through a telescope out into the cosmos. All you have to do is look in a mirror. We don't believe that. We don't believe that about ourselves. But it doesn't make any difference if we're aware of it or if we believe it. You see, some things are true whether we're aware of them or not. And it is the clear record of Scriptures that God's majesty is on display in his human body project. Let's begin by looking at the atoms in the human body. You have 10 to the 28th atoms in the human body. That's 1 with 28 zeros after it. This is a huge number. There are probably only about 10 to the 20th to 10 to the 24th stars in the universe. I tell young doctors that I used to teach for 15 years that the body is more complicated than the universe. I also tell them that no doctor has ever understood the human body. 10 to the 28th atoms, 90% of these turn over every year, and 100% of the atoms in your body turn over every 5 years. As a matter of fact, in the next 1/1,000,000th of a second, you will turn over 1 trillion atoms. Aren't you glad that doesn't hurt? Aren't you glad your doctor can't charge for that? I mean, how is this happening? 1 trillion atoms every 1/1,000,000th of a second. I mean, where do they go? Atoms are atoms. They're elements. You see, you're not destroying the atom and creating a new one. They are elements. They've existed for a very long period of time, and all I'm saying is you use them for a while, then you don't use them any longer. Where did they go? Look at your neighbor. Your neighbor, as a matter of fact, has some of them. We leak. Physically and metaphysically, we leak. There's a kid in Mongolia today that's probably using a carbon atom that I was using when I was growing up. This is simple math, but it's hard for us to believe. Genesis 3 says, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." We always thought that was the beginning and the end of life, but now we find out it's happening to us even while we sit here. Your car doesn't do this. I mean, your car doesn't have atomic turnover all the time. It just sits there at the curb. But for some reason, God in his wisdom ordained that the human body would do this. Buckminster Fuller, a very creative scientist of some years back, says, "I seem to be a verb." Let's go beyond the atom to the subatomic particles. When we found the proton, neutron, and electron, we said, okay, this is it. There's nothing smaller than this. This is the fundamental layer. This is the bottom of all of the universe. But we were a little premature in that pronouncement. Not only did we find the quarks underlying those, but also 200 subatomic particles. that are smaller and more fleeting than the proton, neutron, electron. There's one called the Xi. The Xi has a lifespan of 1/10,000,000th of a second. 1/10,000,000,000th of a second. So in this amount of time, 10 billion generations of Xis have come and gone. Did God really have to make a Xi? I mean, why in the world do we have Xis? I think God was just showing off. He was having fun. He was on a roll. And he said this will keep 10,000 scientists busy for a decade trying to track this little critter. You know, no matter what kind of equipment we have that can penetrate the atom and the subatomic particles further and deeper, we always end up finding another little critter winking at our cameras. There are serious physicists that are now speculating we might be infinite in the subatomic direction. In other words, if you could stand on the border or edge of an atom and dive in, you might never find the bottom. For example, superstrings. Superstrings are, I don't know if you follow the literature of theoretical physics or not, but superstrings are kind of a theoretical construct, very, very complex mathematics. And the reason that they're doing this is they're looking to solve some of the deeper questions and issues in physics, particularly reconciling relativity with quantum mechanics. And superstrings fill that role, so they might indeed be there. If superstrings are true, they are tiny little vibrating energy packets that are 100 million billion times smaller than a proton. What's up with that? I mean, why did God... If God is every place all the time, we don't have a trouble thinking about that when we think about galaxies or when we think about the human body. But how about subatomic? God is down there as well. We have to accept the consequences of that. Let's go up from the subatomic into the atom and now into the cells. You see, if you put 1 trillion atoms together, now you have a cell. And the human body has about 100 trillion cells. We have about 215 different kinds of cells in the human body, and you are turning over 1 trillion cells a day. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians, though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. It turns out that he was talking about good biology as well, even though the verse obviously applies to the spiritual realm. Let's look at the 215 different kinds of cells. For example, the lining of your GI tract. It's very delicate, and you turn over the lining of the GI tract about every 2 days, a little faster if you eat Mexican food. The red blood cells last about 4 months. They just keep running circles. They go from the heart down to the toe, and then the heart up to the ear, and they run the lap about every minute, and then after 4 months, that's it. I don't know why that's it. It's just that's the end. Your bone cells last about 7 years. Your brain cells last 100 years. Your skin lasts about 14 days. If you have a tan or you have some super glue on your skin, the super glue doesn't sort of finally break up and break off at 14 days. It's just that you're sloughing your skin. You have multiple layers of skin, and it migrates to the outside, and it desiccates, it dries, and pretty soon it sloughs off. And in a lifetime, you shed about 40 pounds of dead skin. And I'm convinced that's why old sofas weigh so much. I have a T-shirt that I received here not too long ago, and it said, I wear this on my lazy days. It says, on a cellular level, I really am quite busy. True. Now, how is all this being watched over? I mean, how is all this taking place without errors? How do we continue to live with this dramatic turnover that we see in the human body all the time? Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17 says this, for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I would suggest that if God stops with the command for things to hold together, we all would fly. Let's look at the heart and the blood vessels and the red blood cells. The heart beats 2.5 billion times in a lifetime. 2.5 billion times. Imagine the faithfulness of the human heart. It pushes blood around 60,000 miles of blood vessels. The tiniest blood vessels we have are called capillaries. You have the arteries and you have the veins, and we know about those, but in between are the capillaries. And the tiniest capillaries are so small that the little red blood cells have to go single file through these little capillaries and even have to distort their tiny red blood cell bodies in order to fit through the capillaries. The capillary wall is so delicate that you could tear the wall of the capillary with 1/3000th the tension required to tear toilet tissue. The red blood cells, we make about 2 million every second. Some people, at times of greater need, make as many as 10 million red blood cells every second. If you took the red blood cells out of your body and put them under a microscope, they look like a little red donut. They're red on the outside and a little bit clearer in the middle. And if you put them side by side from your body, took the red blood cells out side by side, they go around the earth at the equator 4 times. Most of us are not aware of this, but you see, it's true anyway. Leviticus 17 says the life of a creature is in the blood. And then listen to the second part of verse 11 here. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. God, in setting up a redemptive system for our fallenness, for our sin, decided to use blood. I'm wondering sometimes if God paused when he was creating the red blood cells, knowing that Jesus would have to shed these red blood cells for us. Now, there's some seminaries that say don't talk about how much blood that Jesus shed, because he didn't shed a lot of blood. We know, talk about the suffering, talk about the death, those are clear and obvious, but we don't know exactly how much blood he shed, so maybe don't bring that up that often. But I did some calculations, and I have proven that in the first couple of drops, Jesus shed enough red blood cells for every human being that's ever lived. Somewhere between 12 and 30 billion people that have ever lived, and there are that many red blood cells in the first couple of drops to come out of Jesus. I don't want to overly spiritualize this. I can't tell you if that's significant or not significant, but if one red blood cell came out of Jesus' body that had my name on it, that is sufficient to pay for my sin, a divine red blood cell. How about your white blood cells and your platelets? They don't last very long at all. The red blood cell lasts 4 months, but the white blood cells and platelets last just a matter of days. They were born to die. The reason God designed white blood cells and platelets that cruise around in your bloodstream along with the red blood cells is that they could lay down their life in defense of you and your health. They were born to sacrifice themselves. The white blood cells are looking for a fight. They're looking for a war. They're looking for invading organisms that would come into the body. A lot of it is through the throat, and so you get a sore throat and you get swollen glands or swollen lymph nodes. This is a battle that is taking place, and untold thousands of white blood cells are laying down their life that you might live. Platelets are cruising around looking for a little tear in that capillary wall, and they throw their little body into that hole and stop the bleeding so that you might live. John 15, Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends." Our white blood cells and our platelets are acting Christianly. How about our lungs? How about the oxygen that we breathe? You know, over a lifetime, we breathe 630 million times. And think about this. Every breath that we take, right now, in your lungs, right now, you have 10 to the 22nd air molecules, one with 22 zeros after it. Every breath that you take contains 150 million air molecules breathed by Jesus. I'm not talking about like the ones breathed by Jesus or distant ancestors of the ones breathed by Jesus, but exactly, precisely these same ones that Jesus used when he was walking on earth. This is a direct quote from a book called Physics and the Human Body, written by 3 physicists. It's not a work of theology or religious text, and yet this quote is in there, and it's actually pretty easy to prove using mathematics and physics. You have, on average, about 1 air molecule from every breath that Jesus took when he was alive, including when he was on the cross. When he was on the cross and he was gasping on the cross, you have 1 of those air molecules for every gasp that Jesus had on the cross in your lungs right now. Daniel spoke of the God who holds in his hand your breath. Let's look at the eye. If you close your eyelid, you know what? Your eye is taking pictures of the backside of your eye. Your eye is taking pictures continuously. If Kodak sent you a bill for all the pictures that your eye took, you could not afford 5 minutes. And yet there it is. The brightness conditions that the eye can see under vary by a factor of 10 billion. Now, dogs and cats can see under darker conditions than we can, but they only extend this brightness condition variability of 10 billion a little bit. We already have remarkable function in the human eye. I read in a magazine, computer magazine, Byte magazine, the following quote by a biomedical engineer. He said, "It would take a minimum of 100 years of cray time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second." Now forget that, and I will tell you what it means. I'll tell you what he said. The retina of your eye works in essence by solving nonlinear differential equations. What the retina of your eye does, every 1/3 of a second, it would take a Cray supercomputer 100 years to do. The psalmist wrote, "He that formed the eyes, shall he not see?" And we read in the book of Revelation, the 1st chapter, "A day is coming when every eye will see him." Right now, not every eye sees, not every ear hears, but a day is coming when every eye will see him. I run toward that. I don't run away from that. I'm looking forward to it. How about the human ear? The human ear is even more amazing than the eye in many ways. It has 1,000,000 moving parts. It can hear over a range of sound intensity that varies by a factor of 1 trillion. The eye was 10 billion. This is 1 trillion. Now, I'm talking and you're hearing because there's these sound waves, right? When was the last time you saw a sound wave? We don't see sound waves. We just take them for granted, don't we? I mean, it's been many, many years now that we just take sound waves for granted. Now, you can hear because of sound waves. Is that because the sound wave has a lot of force and a lot of energy associated with it? Or does the sound wave not have much force and energy? Instead, the hearing mechanism is very sensitive and very delicate. It turns out that the reason any of us hear is completely because of the sensitivity of the hearing mechanism. The sound wave has almost no energy associated with it at all. A person could talk continuously for 100 years and not generate enough energy to boil a cup of water. The brain weighs 3 pounds. The male brain weighs 4 ounces more than a female brain because God knew we needed more to stay even, I suspect. Isaac Asimov, who was an avowed atheist up until his death, wrote the following sentence, which is a compliment to God, even though Asimov did not realize it at the time. He said, "The brain is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe." A stunning statement, as a matter of fact, which I think is completely true and a tribute to the genius of God who designed the human brain. We have somewhere between 10 and 100 billion neurons. A neuron is the cell of the central nervous system. So in your brain is made up with neurons, and each neuron has about 10,000 little filamentous projections called dendrites that stick out from the neuron, and these dendrites are connected to other dendrites from other neurons. So in our body, in your brain, and throughout your nervous system, you have 100 trillion neurological interconnections. 100 trillion neurological interconnections. If you were to take all of this nervous tissue out of your body and you were to stretch it out and superglue the ends together and stretch it out and keep walking and keep going, it would reach 100,000 miles. That's why it takes 2 Valium. You've heard this before, that the capacity of the human brain, if you wrote it into books, it would be 25 million books. That's more books than in all of the Library of Congress. We don't believe this about ourselves, but it's true. If you put those books on a bookshelf, it would be 500 miles long. How about this? The brain is capable of 10,000 trillion computations per second. Let's stop there for a second. 10,000 trillion computations per second. And you can't find your keys. I can't remember my license plate. I don't know my PIN numbers. 10,000 trillion. Now, the fastest computer made by humans is 1,000 times slower than the human brain. It's an IBM computer. It weighs 105 tons. The human brain weighs 3 pounds. But it has 12 trillion computations per second. But God has a little twinkle in his eye, and he's saying, come on, you're catching up to me. You're catching up. Let's think about the brain a little bit for a moment. Think about the accomplishments of the human brain. And we're not paying tribute to the human brain. We're paying tribute to a God that could design a brain that could perform like this. There's a man from India, for example, who memorized the number pi. Pi is a non-repeating number. And he memorized it out to the 30,000th digit. It's a non-repeating number, every digit unique, and it just keeps going on out to 30,000 digits. And later he was outdone by a Japanese man who remembered pi out to the 42nd thousandth digit. I don't think I could remember it out to 10. There's a German musician. He read a symphony that was unfamiliar to him. He read it just once, and later that evening he conducted it from memory. There's a mathematician from Edinburgh. He was asked to divide 4 by 47. You take 47 into 4. After about 30 seconds of giving numbers nonstop, he reached 46 decimal places, and then he said he had arrived at the repeating point. Mozart reported that an entire new composition would suddenly arise in his head. What do these feats reveal about the brain's inherent capacity, and maybe also about the capacity to get that wrong and to be pompous? What about savants? You've heard about savants. They're people with severe mental handicaps that are juxtaposed with remarkable mental abilities, usually in the area of either mathematics or memory or art or music. Now, one person, for example, Leslie, is blind. Leslie is severely mentally handicapped. Leslie has cerebral palsy and has never had any formal musical training. Yet Leslie heard Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 for the first time in his teens, and he played it back on the piano flawlessly without hesitation. There's so much about how the brain works that we do not yet understand. Thinking, intuition, language, memory, sleep, consciousness. We must take care when we think about the brain. The brain must act humbly, or it will sabotage its own search. If the brain gets proud, God will resist the brain. God always resists the proud, and he surely and reliably will resist the brain when it defies him. Can you imagine a 3-pound human brain sitting in judgment on the Almighty? Sometimes we switch the tables, and note that the faith center and the IQ center are in different parts of the human body. You can have a sky-high IQ and you can have 10 PhD degrees from a prestigious university, and you won't be 1 centimeter closer to heaven as a result of that. As a matter of fact, in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, we read about how God has thwarted the wisdom of humanity. It says there, and I'll paraphrase, that as God in his wisdom ordained, man would fail to find God through man's wisdom, but instead through the foolishness of the cross of Christ. There's one way to come to God, and it isn't through education, and it isn't through the brain. How about the human genome and the DNA? In many ways, this is more remarkable than all of the rest that we've been looking at. The Human Genome Project has been on the news many times over the last several years and continues to make news, and I think we must be very careful and very humble, or we could get things wrong with regard to this. If you play on God's playground, you really should ask his permission first, and I'm not sure we have the kind of wisdom necessary to be doing the work we're doing with the human genome. At any rate, the human genome, you have 100 trillion cells, but if you just isolate one cell, and if you look down in that one cell, there is a nucleus, and inside that nucleus are 23 pairs of chromosomes. If you put the 23 pairs of chromosomes together, that is your human genome. that tells so much about who you are and who you have become that's hardwired into that human genome. There are 3 billion base pairs. You see, the human genome and these chromosomes are made up of DNA. DNA is that double helix, and it's twisted and it's coiled and it's redundant and backs over. And in that DNA, that stretch of DNA, there's 3 billion base pairs. There's about 30,000 genes. I'm talking about one cell, one nucleus, one human genome, about 30,000 genes. We thought initially it was going to be about 100,000. But then after they started doing all the research on it and mapping the site of each gene, it's looking more like 35 to 30,000. Now they're saying probably 30,000, which is a little stunning because that's what mice have, for example, or corn has, or a roundworm, an intestinal parasite, has 20,000 genes. So it's a little humbling or strange to think about the human genome containing only 30,000 genes. If you were to take the DNA from one cell, from one nucleus out, and you were to stretch that DNA from one cell, it would be about 6 feet long. Now, if you were to take all the DNA from your whole body and take it out of your whole body and then crumple it together, it would fit inside an ice cube. But if you took all that, instead of crumpling it together, if you took all that and stretched it out and superglued or taped the ends together, it would reach about 100 billion miles. This is another of those things I don't think you guessed about yourself, and yet it is true whether we know it or don't know it. It is true. It's God's genius on display. Back up the video camera a long way to when you were just one cell. Remember in your mother's fallopian tube a long time ago, you were one cell. There was the cell, there was the nucleus, there was the human genome inside that cell. That was your initial single cell DNA, half from your father, half from your mother, combined to make you. How much did that weigh? How much did that blueprint weigh that God used to grow you? Well, 0.2 of a millionth of an ounce. That's how much it weighed. Now, if you take the 6 billion people alive today on planet Earth, and you were to weigh their collective initial single-cell DNA from all 6 billion people, from the first cell, the DNA that God used to grow 6 billion people, how much would the total weigh? 1/1000th of an ounce. Every human body is a miracle that exceeds comprehension. We simply can't make our minds go that far, even when we invoke our imagination. It is stunning, and yet this is God's majesty on display. No doctor has ever understood the human body, as I've already said. No engineer, no biologist has ever understood. It is too complicated, it's too mysterious, it's too mystical. And yes, clearly it is too miraculous for us to completely understand it. I guess it's possible for us to take a good look at all of this and not be impressed with God, but I think we have to be in a metaphysical coma. There's a biologist from Scotland, his name is Sir Arthur Thomson. He said, "We speak of the body as a machine, but it's hardly necessary to say that none of the most ingenious machines set up by modern science can for a moment compare with it. The body is a self-building machine, a self-stoking, self-regulating, self-repairing machine, the most marvelous and unique automatic mechanism in the universe." End of quote. The body is a pinnacle of God's creation. It's the zenith of His genius. We are made in His image. We are crowned with glory and honor. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own. You're bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body." Notice Paul isn't saying don't honor the body, honor the God who created your body and who now makes it His temple, the temple of the Holy Spirit.